Hello everybody and welcome along to this video, which is Mr. Johnson Teaches Extract from the Prelude, the revision. So this is part of your English GCSE literature and you'll find it in paper 2, and within paper 2 you'll find it in section B, and this is where the exam board will print a question and they will also print a poem from the power and conflict cluster, and it's up to you then to choose the second poem which you think best answers the question that you can compare with the first poem they've given you. So it might well be that they decide to print Extract from the Prelude and name it. It might well be that they don't and then you choose it yourself. It's definitely a good one for comparisons. Either way, it's definitely one that I think you should know. Be ready to pause this video as always. It's really important that you're being active with your revision. If you don't have your copy of the poem to make notes on, then definitely make sure you've got pen and paper ready. Either way, let's get going. And if you wanted to find a copy of the poem, as I've put on the bottom of the screen there, you could search for Wordsworth Extract from the Prelude. It's easy to find online, so if you want to print a copy off, if you haven't got your own, then do so now and pause the video. If not, let's get going. So then, we want to pause and read the poem to yourself, please. I always ask you to do these on my revision videos because it's really important you have this poem in your head and fresh in your head. So do so now, pause this video and take your time to just go through the poem, reminding yourself of it. And I'm presuming that you have paused and had a go at that, so let's move on with some analysis. Starting off with William Wordsworth himself. So you can see the dates. He is an older poet, or certainly he was. He's older in the sense that he died quite a long time ago. This is one of the oldest poems in the anthology he's written. He was one of the Romantic poets, and you can see that's Romantic with an R, as if it's the name they gave to themselves. He spent a lot of time living up in the Lake District, which is like in the northwest of England. He spent a lot of time walking around there. He really knew nature. He was outdoors a lot. And as it says on the second bullet point, his poems are a lot about trying to restore our relationship between man and nature. This was a time period where there was certainly the revolution, the industrial revolution was starting to happen. There was a lot more focus on machines and technology. And this group felt that we were losing our contact and losing our relationship we'd had for so many hundreds of years with nature. And they wanted to bring that back. It's also got some other points there that the Romantics were interested in, so I'll let you have a look at those yourself. You could obviously do a lot more research. You don't need to write a life history of William Wordsworth if you write about the poem, but it's useful to know the fact that if this is what he had as an idea and wanted to show us about nature, then that definitely appears in the poem, so you can almost link the poem to what he was trying to achieve by writing it. Some context for you as well. So it's called Extract from the Prelude. That basically means an extract is part of a much longer autobiographical poem. He was starting to write his life in the form of poetry. And it was written first in 1798. And basically sort of about the growth and his development as a boy. As I've already mentioned, he spent a lot of time in looking and exploring the Lake District. You can see it there on the screen. It's an absolutely beautiful part of the world, but also certainly he would have experienced very pleasant nature, but also seen the power that nature could have over us, which works quite well, as this poem is in the power and conflict cluster. So that's a little bit of context for you. Let's think about the title. We should always think about titles when analysing the poems. So extract literally is part of a whole bigger poem, but prelude, the word prelude is an introduction, so it comes before something more important. So perhaps you could argue that maybe this is sort of an event which led to the rest of his life. This almost was, the word is formative, almost forms part of his life and almost created the man that he was. You could possibly argue that's reading into it quite a bit. But the question you can ask is the prelude to what? What came next after this? Right, and before we read any further, I just wanted to point out to you that is the poem shrunk down but printed as it was written. So notice that we have no stanzas, so there's no breaks in this poem. There is no rhyme scheme in this poem at all. There is a lot of enjambment going on. Now, enjambment isn't a loss of control. Poets do it deliberately, but they almost maybe use it to mirror like the passion spilling over, or their thoughts, or the power spilling over onto lines. Not all lines have enjambment, but it is quite frequent in there as well. What you do get in there is what I've highlighted in bold, iambic pentameter, where you have got this regular beat, and there are 10 beats per line there. You could actually call it, which I haven't got on the slide there, blank verse is what you call this, because it is poetic. It has the same rhythm, so it's got a poetic rhythm to the lines, having those 10 beats, but what it doesn't have is the rhyme that goes with it. So blank verse is something you could talk about with the structure of this poem. So he has structured it, and it has got a structure to it, but it also seems to have like a loss of control in places. So maybe you could try and look at how that mirrors what's going on in the poem. So we'll go through bit by bit. It's a long poem, so I'm not going to have a huge amount of time to talk about all of it. You could even call this an epic poem, EPIC, which is a much longer poem. Epic poems run on for pages and pages. One summer evening led by her, ask yourself the question, who is her, personifying this person. I found a little boat tied to a willow tree, a rocky cove, its usual home. I straight iron loosed her chain, stepping in, pushed from the shore. It's like he's carefree. He just sees this boat, instinct, impulsive, grabs it, and off he goes. I've stopped that line deliberately short there. It does go on in the next stanza, but that would be a caesura going on there as well, like breaks within lines. Pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. There's an oxymoron there. Pleasure, yet it's troubled pleasure. Is that sort of him being a bit of a young scamp, being a bit of a pain, like sometimes young people can be? His troubled pleasure. He knows he shouldn't be doing it, but he wants to. Nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon. This is a rowing boat, so he's rowing it and the oars are dipping in and they're leaving lovely sort of ripples and circles in the moonlight. It all sounds really beautiful. You could highlight lots of the very natural imagery that's going on in this poem. Look at the fact that they melted into one track, which is a very gentle verb. So there's a very gentle tone to this opening portion of the poem. Sparkling light, but now like one who rows, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with unswerving line, right? So he's not moving, he's heading straight for a point. He fixed his view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. So craggy means like really rocky, so he's talking about the mountains there. The horizon's utmost boundary, far above, this is important, was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. So, okay, so looking above him, think about stars. I'll try and mention this briefly later on, but you've got like a real symbolism going on there. Symbolism of heaven, the stars being like the heavens looking down on him, maybe heaven looking down on his guilty action, the bad thing that he's done. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. My boat went heaving through the water like a swan. Now you can't call that oxymoron, but there's a real juxtaposition there. How swans are meant to be seen as something very graceful, swim very gracefully, yet it went heaving through the water. So that verb almost suggests the opposite of what a swan would do. And there's the next bit. So from behind that craggy steep, there came this huge peak, black and huge. That's a really memorable line. He's talking about the mountains, like in this picture here, how they're silhouetted against the backdrop. But black, negative connotations with the words black. The repetition of huge there, like almost it's literally huge, but maybe it has a huge impact on him, you could argue there. Upreared its head, like lifted its head. Now that's real personification, and you get a lot of personification within this poem. I struck and struck again, so he's rowing again, but he feels like it's still growing, like towering up between me and the stars, almost like blocking off his view of the heavens. So symbolically, this is very interesting. The fact he almost feels like it's rising up. Maybe it almost represents his guilt. Maybe the mountains are a personification of his guilt, you could argue. It strode after him, he says there. Now, of course, it didn't literally, but he feels like it is coming after him. With trembling oars, I turned through the silent water and stole my way back to the cover of a willow tree. So he then leaves the boat back where he took it from and basically runs back home, having had this massive moment, feeling like the mountains and everything is watching him and coming for him. I've split this just so you can fit it onto the screen here, really. But this is then the switch that you sort of move. His feelings towards nature have been changed by this experience. So when he gets home, he talks about how his mood has changed and how he can't get rid of the feelings, which is what you're about to see in these lines here. He can't shake off this sort of impression that's been left on him by the mountains. And through the meadows, homeward I went in grave and serious mood. But after I'd seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense. He's like confused and it's just working on him. I love these last few lines on that first box there. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness. That's a great line to remember. The impression that's left on him. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness. And there's a lot of very dark imagery going on here. There, negative imagery in these final few lines. Solitude, blank desertion. Listen to the repetition on this next bit. No familiar shapes remained. No pleasant images of trees, of sky or sea or sky. No colours. Lots of no, but huge and mighty forms. That's all he can see in his mind. So nothing pleasant, just these really dark images, mighty big images that do not live like men, that move slowly through the mind and were a trouble to my dreams. It really sort of carries with it and the impression that's been had on him. I forgot to talk about earlier on, but roughly speaking, line 21, the bit where it goes, when from behind that craggy steep, it almost switches from positive imagery into the darker imagery. And I just want you to know and make a note of the fact that it's called a volta, V-O-L-T-A, like a turning point in the poem. And structurally, that's really important. We almost switch from that positive to negative. So yeah, a question I ask, is this a change in him as the romantic? What he saw before was like nature looking like this, and then of course it's now had a much darker impression on him. Maybe he feels like his relationship with nature has changed. Think about the religious imagery I mentioned earlier as well, the fact that the heavens and stars almost are a link to heaven and God, and the fact that the mountains rise up, or he feels that they rise up between him and the stars, almost feels like he's been cutting off. So this is sort of trying to push you towards some higher marks, these sorts of things I'm pointing out here. I'm definitely not going to have time to read through these questions. Pause these and have a look. They will sort of focus your attention on making some more annotations. It asks you about like the repetition, the personification, and all the sort of different word choices, and these are really important to consider. Which other poems would it compare well with? Certainly Storm on the Island would be a good choice here because you've got two poems dealing with nature. Perhaps Power of Nature. If you think about Ozymandias and nature being time in that poem, then maybe you've got like the sort of feeling that the poets have towards time and nature, if you were to compare it with Ozymandias. And maybe for another one, Tissue would compare quite well. Tissue being very soft, delicate imagery. This one also having that sort of very positive imagery at the beginning, but then that switch. There's a question that you could then write a response to. So it doesn't ask you to make a comparison here, which is what you'd ask in your exam. But this is just a way of you writing about the poem and putting your thoughts down. I've asked you, how does Wordsworth explore the power of nature? I've got an example coming up on the next slide. And if you do yours, then on that box there I've put focus on the imagery of nature, particularly the mountains and the stars that we've talked about. So the fact that it's a huge peak, black and huge, and the sort of the impressions of black and huge, those connotations and how it sort of shows nature in a very intimidating way. And here you go. The final bit for this video is my attempt at writing a paragraph. Before we go through it, the underlined bits are sentence starters that you could then use in your response to the question that you write in a moment. So in the first sentence, I've answered the question and sort of shown my understanding of the poem. I've said how it explores the power of nature, and I've said what the power of nature is. And in this case, I've said how nature has a psychological effect over us. So it's not just physical, but it's also psychological. The second sentence, the blue sentence, I've put he uses, and I've named a method. Always really important to name a method in your answer. Simile, personification, imagery is always a really good and safe bet. The green bit then is where I've tried to embed some quotes. I've tried not to use too many or too long quotes, only use quotes that you're intending to analyse. I focus on the repetition of no there. Then in the red bit I'm analysing, and I'm actually explaining the effect of the repetitions. Okay, by repeating no at the end of the poem, I've said there how it shows sort of the shift and really emphasises how he's moved from something positive to negative. That repetition of no is very negative. The additionally bit in red there is where I've almost tried to sort of add my second idea. If you can push your ideas one stage further, you are likely to gain yourself more marks when it comes to the exam. So don't just say one idea, but try and push yourself on one stage further. Finally, in purple, use those sentence starters. That's me showing what Wordsworth was trying to teach us through this poem. So by reading this, what do we learn? In this case, what do we learn about nature? He has shown us an experience with nature. What have we learnt about his experience and maybe about our own? and that's what you'll see in the purple there. So I've run out of time. It only leaves me time to say thank you very much for listening, and well done for making it all the way through. I wish you the very best of luck when it comes to your exams. Work hard, revise, and show the examiners what you know. Bye bye.